Get on your knees and wipe those shoes. Maybe then you'll finally earn your paycheck." The words sliced through the ballroom so cleanly that even the string quartet seemed to lose its rhythm for a heartbeat. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors while hundreds of executives, investors, and invited guests turned toward the voice. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the grand stage, every inch the confident white CEO, whose tailored navy tuxedo and effortless smile had become synonymous with one of America's fastest-growing hospitality companies. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. Cameras flashed from every corner of the ballroom. Champagne glasses shimmered beneath golden light. Giant LED screens displayed the company's newest slogan about integrity, respect, and building a better future together. Yet every eye now rested on the young black waitress standing only a few feet away from Richard. Maya Brooks remained perfectly still, balancing a silver serving tray with practiced precision despite the sudden silence that had settled over the room. Her crisp white shirt was neatly pressed beneath a charcoal vest, and her name tag reflected the chandelier above her like a tiny mirror. She couldn't have looked more ordinary if she had tried. Just another temporary server hired for one evening's corporate gala. Richard glanced down at the small splash of sparkling water that had landed near the polished leather of his expensive Italian shoes after another guest accidentally bumped Maya's tray moments earlier. The spill was barely noticeable, no larger than a silver dollar, but Richard looked at it as though it were an unforgivable offense. He slowly extended one foot toward her, never taking his eyes off the audience surrounding them. "Well?" he asked with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Everyone's waiting." A few nervous laughs escaped from nearby executives. Nobody wanted to challenge the man who had spent years convincing the business world that he alone had built Whitmore Hospitality into an empire stretching across 43 states. Several members of the board exchanged uncomfortable glances before quickly looking away. Others lifted their champagne glasses, pretending to be distracted by conversations that no longer existed. Maya looked briefly at the polished shoe before raising her eyes to meet Richard's. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment either, only a quiet steadiness that somehow felt completely out of place amid the glittering room filled with wealth and status. "I'm sorry about the spill, sir," she said calmly. "I'll bring you a clean towel immediately." Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head as though correcting a child who had misunderstood a simple instruction. "No," he replied, loud enough for the microphones near the stage to capture every word. "You'll clean them yourself. Right here." Another wave of uneasy laughter rippled through the ballroom. Maya didn't move. The orchestra had stopped entirely now, leaving only the low hum of air conditioning and the distant clink of glass somewhere across the massive room. For the first time that evening, several investors began watching Richard instead of the presentation screens. Something about the young waitress's composure made the moment feel strangely heavier than anyone expected. Richard folded his arms across his chest, convinced the silence belonged to him. He had no idea that within the next few minutes, every person in that ballroom would remember this night for a reason far different than the one printed on the elegant invitations. Maya Brooks did not lower her eyes. Instead, she offered the same calm expression she had worn since the beginning of her shift, the kind that came from years of learning that dignity could survive even when respect was absent. She gently placed the silver tray onto a nearby service table before taking one careful step backward, creating just enough distance to avoid turning the moment into something even larger. Around her, conversations remained suspended in uncomfortable silence. Some guests looked away. Others stared openly, curious to see whether the young waitress would surrender to the pressure that seemed to fill every inch of the magnificent ballroom. Earlier that afternoon, long before the first limousine rolled beneath the hotel's covered entrance, Maya had arrived carrying nothing more than a small black tote bag and a neatly folded employee uniform. She greeted the security officers by name after reading their badges, thanked the kitchen staff for preparing meals that hundreds of strangers would never fully appreciate, and even stopped to help an elderly florist gather several white orchids that had slipped from a delivery cart onto the polished floor. Nobody noticed those quiet moments because they were ordinary. Maya preferred it that way. The event coordinator had assigned her to the executive ballroom only because another server had called in sick that morning. It was supposed to be an easy assignment. Refill glasses. Clear empty plates. stay invisible. That last instruction had been repeated twice before the ballroom doors opened. Guests noticed mistakes, not servers. The supervisor had reminded everyone. Maya simply smiled and nodded. She had spent enough years understanding how easily people overlooked someone wearing a name tag and carrying a serving tray. Yet invisibility had never changed who she was. She still thanked every dishwasher before leaving the kitchen. She still carried extra linen napkins in case another server ran short during a busy hour. She still remembered birthdays, favorite desserts, and the names of children she met only once. Small acts rarely appeared in company reports, but Maya believed they revealed more about a person than any executive title ever could. As the evening unfolded, several employees quietly gravitated toward her without realizing why. A nervous young busboy dropped an entire stack of dessert forks, his hands trembling as silverware scattered across the floor with sharp metallic echoes. Before anyone else reacted, Maya knelt beside him, helping gather every piece while whispering that accidents happen to everyone. The teenager managed a grateful smile before returning to work. A few minutes later, one of the banquet chefs sent out fresh coffee for the board members. Maya noticed the elderly chairman rubbing his temples while reviewing documents between speeches. Without interrupting him, she exchanged his regular coffee for decaffeinated tea after remembering a brief conversation she had overheard in the kitchen about his heart medication. The chairman accepted the cup with a quiet nod, never asking who had remembered. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore never saw any of it. His attention remained fixed on photographers, shareholders, and the giant presentation screens displaying rising profits and ambitious expansion plans. In his world, success was measured by quarterly earnings, acquisition announcements, and applause delivered from expensive seats. The people moving silently around the edges of the room blended into the polished walls like part of the decoration itself. He believed he understood every person beneath his authority after only a glance. Tonight, that confidence would become the most expensive misjudgment of his career. Richard Whitmore had built an image that financial magazines loved to print. Every business publication described him as decisive, fearless, and impossible to outmaneuver. Television interviews praised his confidence. Investors admired his relentless ambition. Employees learned quickly that questioning his decisions rarely led anywhere except the exit door. At 48 years old, Richard carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed every success around him existed because of his own intelligence. His silver cuff links caught the chandelier light each time he lifted another crystal glass to greet a shareholder, while photographers eagerly captured every carefully rehearsed smile. To the outside world, he represented the perfect American executive, polished, disciplined, and always in complete control. Inside the company, however, people spoke differently once office doors closed. Department heads avoided bringing him bad news until they had exhausted every possible solution. Managers rehearsed presentations repeatedly before entering his conference room, because one overlooked detail often resulted in public embarrassment. Administrative assistants quietly warned new employees never to surprise him, never to contradict him, and never to make him wait. Richard believed pressure revealed excellence. Few dared argue that fear usually revealed silence instead. Standing only a few steps behind him was Olivia Carter, the company's chief operating officer, whose composed expression barely concealed growing concern. She had worked alongside Richard for nearly 8 years and understood his habits better than almost anyone. She noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw whenever attention shifted away from him. She recognized the faint impatience that appeared whenever conversations involved people outside the executive circle. Tonight, that familiar expression had returned the moment Maya remained standing instead of immediately obeying. Olivia glanced across the ballroom and noticed several long-time board members exchanging unusually cautious looks. One elderly director adjusted his glasses while studying the young waitress with unexpected curiosity. Another leaned toward the company attorney, Daniel Hayes, whispering something too quietly for anyone nearby to hear. Daniel did not answer. Instead, he opened a slim leather portfolio resting beside his chair and briefly checked his watch before closing it again. The movement lasted only a second, yet it carried an unusual sense of purpose that Olivia could not explain. Richard continued speaking as though nothing around him had changed. He welcomed investors from New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles, thanking them for believing in the company's future. Behind him, enormous screens displayed architectural renderings of luxury hotels scheduled to open over the next 3 years. Every image celebrated expansion, prestige, and limitless growth. Applause echoed through the ballroom each time another ambitious projection appeared. Richard absorbed every clap with visible satisfaction. He enjoyed admiration almost as much as achievement itself. Meanwhile, Maya quietly stepped aside after setting fresh glasses onto a nearby table. She resumed serving guests with the same steady professionalism she had shown all evening, neither rushing nor hesitating. A retired board member accepted a glass of sparkling water from her and paused for a brief moment after reading her name tag. His forehead furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Brooks," he repeated softly, almost to himself. Maya answered with a polite smile. "Yes, sir." Before he could ask another question, another executive called him away, leaving the thought unfinished. Across the room, Daniel Hayes noticed the exchange. His eyes rested on Maya for only an instant before returning to the sealed envelope inside his portfolio. He quietly placed one hand over it, as though confirming it was still there. Above them, the chandeliers continued scattering warm golden light across polished marble, but beneath that elegance, something invisible had begun shifting. Only a handful of people sensed it. Richard Whitmore was not one of them. The applause gradually faded as Richard Whitmore raised one hand, signaling that the evening's biggest announcement was about to begin. The massive screens behind him shifted from promotional videos to a single image displaying the words Vision 2030. A polished wooden podium stood beneath the company's silver logo, illuminated by soft white spotlights that reflected across the marble stage. Every conversation disappeared. Investors leaned forward. Journalists lifted their cameras. Members of the board straightened in their seats. Richard smiled with complete confidence. This was his moment. He thanked everyone for believing in the company's future before announcing that the board would soon approve an expansion unlike anything in the organization's history. New luxury resorts, international partnerships, thousands of additional employees, record profits. Every sentence drew another round of applause. Richard welcomed the admiration as naturally as breathing. Beside the ballroom entrance, Maya continued replacing empty glasses with fresh ones, moving quietly between tables without interrupting anyone. She appeared focused only on her work, yet her eyes briefly settled on a thick navy folder resting near the podium. The company's embossed seal gleamed beneath the lights. She recognized it immediately. It was not simply another presentation binder. It was a legal authorization package prepared for signatures. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Calm remained on her face, but a deeper concentration settled behind her eyes. Several years earlier, she had spent countless hours reviewing documents that looked remarkably similar, learning that the smallest overlooked clause could quietly reshape the future of an entire corporation. She continued serving guests while occasionally glancing toward the folder, never drawing attention to herself. Richard accepted a fountain pen from Olivia Carter and announced that after one final approval from the board, the documents would officially authorize the company's next chapter. More applause echoed through the ballroom. Daniel Hayes remained seated without clapping. His fingers rested lightly on the sealed envelope inside his leather portfolio, while his eyes shifted between Richard and Maya. Something about the timing unsettled him, although he could not explain why. Richard opened the folder with theatrical confidence. Several board members reached for their own copies as assistants distributed matching documents across the front tables. Maya quietly approached with a tray of bottled water for the executive table. She set one bottle beside Olivia, another beside Daniel, then paused for less than a second as Richard flipped toward the signature page. Her heartbeat remained steady. Her breathing did not change. Finally, she spoke with the same respectful tone she had used throughout the evening. "Excuse me, sir." Richard barely looked up. "Not now." Maya remained composed. "I apologize for interrupting, but before anyone signs those documents, there is something you should verify." The room grew unexpectedly still. Richard slowly lifted his head, annoyance replacing the polished smile he had displayed moments earlier. A few executives exchanged puzzled looks while several reporters instinctively aimed their cameras toward the unusual interruption. Olivia's eyes narrowed with concern. Daniel Hayes quietly closed his portfolio without making a sound. Richard looked directly at Maya as though surprised a server had spoken twice in the same evening. "Are you giving legal advice now?" he asked with a faint laugh that encouraged a few uncertain chuckles around the ballroom. Maya did not react to the laughter. She simply met his gaze with quiet certainty. "No, sir," she answered. "I am asking you to make sure every page reflects the authority you believe it does." The sentence lingered in the silent ballroom like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Richard's smile slowly returned, but this time it carried something colder. Around the executive table, several board members looked down at the documents in front of them for reasons they could not fully explain, while Daniel Hayes placed one hand on the sealed envelope beside him, knowing the next few minutes would change every life inside that room. Richard Whitmore let out a slow, amused laugh that echoed through the silent ballroom. The sound invited a handful of executives to laugh with him, although their smiles looked far less certain than before. He closed the navy folder with deliberate confidence and rested both hands on the polished podium. "This," he said, glancing toward Maya, "is exactly why everyone should stay in the role they were hired to perform." A few scattered chuckles drifted across the room. Richard continued, his voice smooth and measured. "Running a corporation requires experience, discipline, and judgment. Carrying a serving tray does not qualify someone to interrupt a board meeting." Several reporters exchanged quick looks before raising their cameras again. The unexpected confrontation had become far more interesting than the expansion announcement they had arrived to cover. Maya remained standing beside the executive table, her posture relaxed, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply waited, allowing the silence to speak louder than any interruption could have. Richard interpreted that silence as surrender. "Security," he called without raising his voice. Two hotel security officers near the ballroom entrance immediately looked toward the stage. They hesitated for only a moment before walking across the marble floor with careful, professional steps. Neither appeared angry. Both seemed uncomfortable, aware that every guest in the room was watching them. Olivia Carter quietly leaned toward Richard. "Perhaps we should verify what she meant before making this public," she whispered. Richard barely turned his head. "There is nothing to verify." His answer was firm enough that Olivia said nothing further. Across the table, Daniel Hayes slowly removed his glasses and cleaned one lens with a folded handkerchief, buying himself a few extra seconds. He watched Maya carefully. She showed no fear, no frustration, only remarkable patience, as though the outcome of the evening had never depended on convincing anyone to believe her. One of the security officers stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said gently, "our event manager has asked us to escort you outside." Maya offered him a small, understanding smile. "I understand. Thank you for speaking respectfully." Her kindness caught him off guard. He nodded almost apologetically before stepping slightly to one side, allowing her to walk without pressure. As Maya turned toward the ballroom doors, an older woman seated among the original investors quietly stood from her chair. Eleanor Grant had served on the advisory council for more than 20 years and rarely spoke during public events. She watched Maya walk away with unmistakable curiosity. "That young woman," Eleanor said softly to the director beside her, "has the same eyes." The director frowned. "The same as who?" Eleanor never answered. She continued watching Maya until she reached the grand ballroom entrance. Just before the doors opened, Maya paused for the briefest moment and looked back toward the stage. Her eyes met Daniel Hayes for less than a second. Nothing was spoken, yet Daniel immediately understood. With a slow breath, he reached into his leather portfolio and placed his fingertips against the thick sealed envelope that had remained untouched throughout the evening. The company's seal pressed into the ivory paper reflected beneath the chandelier light. Richard noticed the movement. "Daniel," he called confidently, "once security clears the room, we can proceed with the signatures." Daniel did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the envelope resting beneath his hand. Around the ballroom, conversations had completely disappeared. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that something far more important than a corporate announcement was about to unfold. Maya quietly stepped beyond the ballroom doors without protest, disappearing into the softly lit hallway outside. The heavy doors closed behind her with a gentle click that somehow sounded louder than the applause from only minutes earlier. Inside the ballroom, Richard smiled once again and reached for his fountain pen, completely unaware that the document capable of defining who truly held authority over every person in that room had not yet been opened. Outside the ballroom, the noise of applause dissolved into a quiet hum that barely reached the wide marble hallway. The polished floor reflected rows of warm wall sconces, turning the empty corridor into a river of soft amber light. Maya Brooks stopped beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights stretched across the evening, blinking beneath a sky where low gray clouds slowly drifted over the rooftops. A light rain had begun to fall, tracing gentle paths down the enormous panes of glass until the bright buildings beyond appeared softened, almost dreamlike. Maya rested one hand lightly against the strap of her small black tote bag and closed her eyes for a brief moment. She inhaled slowly, filling her lungs before releasing the breath with quiet control. Her heartbeat had never raced inside the ballroom. It remained steady now. Years earlier, someone had taught her that dignity was not measured by how loudly a person defended themselves, but by how calmly they carried the truth when no one else wanted to hear it. She remembered those words now, not with sadness, but with gratitude. A young hotel employee quietly stepped into the hallway carrying an empty tray. It was the same nervous busboy she had helped earlier after he dropped the dessert forks. He hesitated before approaching her. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I just wanted to say, I am sorry about what happened in there." Maya looked at him and offered the same gentle smile that had comforted him hours before. "Thank you," she answered. "Do not let someone else's choice change the kind of person you decide to become." The young man lowered his eyes for a moment before nodding. "I will remember that." Without another word, he returned toward the service corridor, walking a little taller than before. Maya watched him disappear around the corner before turning back toward the rain-covered window. Inside her tote bag rested a thick ivory envelope sealed with dark blue wax. She slowly removed it and held it in both hands. The company crest embossed into the paper shimmered beneath the hallway lights. She studied the seal without breaking it. She had carried the envelope all evening, yet she had never intended to reveal it herself. Some truths meant more when spoken by the people responsible for protecting them. After another quiet breath, she slipped the envelope back into her bag exactly as it had been. Through the closed ballroom doors, muffled voices drifted into the hallway, followed by another brief round of applause that quickly faded again. Somewhere inside, Richard Whitmore was almost certainly preparing to sign documents that represented the future he believed he controlled. Maya showed no satisfaction at the thought. There was no desire for revenge in her expression, only hope that when the truth finally arrived, it would change more than a title on an organizational chart. She hoped it might change a heart. At the far end of the hallway, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Daniel Hayes stepped out carrying his leather portfolio close against his side. His pace was calm but purposeful. When he spotted Maya standing beside the window, he stopped for a brief moment before walking toward her. Neither of them spoke immediately. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass while warm light settled across the marble floor between them. Daniel looked at Maya, then at the unopened envelope resting inside her tote bag, before quietly placing one hand over the matching sealed document inside his own portfolio. He gave a small, respectful nod. Maya returned the gesture with quiet confidence. Behind the ballroom doors, a microphone suddenly went silent. Then came a pause so complete that even through layers of polished wood and thick walls, the absence of sound could be felt. Daniel looked toward the ballroom entrance and exhaled slowly. "It is time," he said. Daniel Hayes pushed open the ballroom doors, and the quiet conversation inside faded into complete silence as every head turned toward him. The leather portfolio remained tucked beneath his arm, but this time he walked with the unmistakable confidence of a man carrying responsibility rather than paperwork. Richard Whitmore looked up from the signature page, his fountain pen already uncapped. "Daniel," he said with an impatient smile, "we have kept our guests waiting long enough." Daniel did not smile back. He stopped beside the podium and spoke with a calm voice that carried naturally through the ballroom without the need for raised volume. "Before a single signature is placed on those documents, The board is legally required to hear an additional declaration that was delivered to our office this afternoon. A ripple of confusion spread across the executive tables. Richard frowned. That can wait until tomorrow. Daniel slowly shook his head. Legally, it cannot. The confidence on Richard's face hesitated for the first time that evening. Daniel opened his portfolio and carefully removed the thick ivory envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Several long-time board members immediately recognized the crest pressed into the seal. Eleanor Grant quietly rose from her chair without taking her eyes off the envelope. That seal, she whispered, almost unable to believe it. Daniel broke the wax with deliberate care and unfolded several notarized documents. The sound of crisp paper echoed through the silent ballroom. For the official record, he began. These documents contain the final succession instructions of our late founder, Jonathan Brooks, together with the completed transfer of ownership held in trust until every legal condition was satisfied. Richard's expression hardened. Jonathan Brooks passed away years ago. His estate was settled. Daniel lifted his eyes from the document. Only partially. The room seemed to stop breathing. Daniel continued reading. Upon fulfillment of the trust conditions, all controlling ownership interests are transferred to the sole beneficiary, Miss Maya Brooks. Several guests gasped softly. Others instinctively turned toward the ballroom entrance, only realizing then that the young waitress had already been escorted outside. Richard laughed once, but the sound carried no confidence. There must be some mistake. Daniel calmly placed another document onto the podium. There is no mistake. The ownership transfer was verified by the probate court, the board's outside counsel, and every financial institution involved. Olivia Carter slowly lowered the folder she had been holding. Her eyes widened as she scanned the legal certification. One by one, board members reached for their own copies. No one questioned the signatures. No one questioned the official seals. Every page confirmed the same conclusion. Daniel spoke once more. Effective immediately, Miss Maya Brooks holds controlling ownership of 78% of Whitmore Hospitality. She is the lawful owner and chairwoman of this corporation. The ballroom fell into absolute silence. Richard looked around the room, searching for someone to object, someone to laugh, someone to rescue the certainty he had carried only moments earlier. No one moved. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing they had just witnessed history rather than a corporate announcement. Eleanor Grant slowly smiled through moist eyes. She has her father's calm, she said quietly. I should have recognized it the moment I saw her. Richard's fountain pen slipped gently from his fingers onto the polished podium, rolling across the wood before coming to a stop beside the unsigned documents. For the first time in many years, he understood that every speech, every applause, every title he had proudly carried had always rested upon authority that had never truly belonged to him. At that same moment, the ballroom doors opened once again. Maya Brooks stepped inside with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning of the evening. She was still wearing the simple waitress uniform. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only now, everyone finally understood who had been standing among them all along. Maya Brooks walked forward without the slightest trace of triumph. On her face, the same uniform she had worn while serving water and clearing plates remained perfectly pressed, and the simple silver name tag on her vest still read only one word, Maya. No expensive jewelry had appeared. No dramatic announcement followed her. The only thing that had changed was the way every person in the ballroom now looked at her. Executives who had barely noticed her minutes earlier slowly rose from their chairs. Conversations disappeared. Even the photographers hesitated before lifting their cameras again, uncertain whether they were witnessing the beginning of a corporate transition or something far more personal. Richard Whitmore remained beside the podium, his shoulders noticeably lower than before. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure where to place his hands. The confidence that had once filled every movement had quietly dissolved beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. As Maya approached, he looked directly into her eyes. There was no anger waiting for him there. Somehow, that unsettled him even more. He took a slow breath before speaking. Miss Brooks, he said quietly, there is no excuse for the way I treated you tonight. His voice no longer carried across the ballroom with practiced authority. It sounded like the voice of a man finally hearing himself clearly. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I saw a uniform and believed I understood your worth. I was wrong. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause earlier that evening. Maya studied him for a brief moment before glancing around the ballroom. She noticed the nervous young busboy standing near the service entrance. She saw the banquet chefs peeking through the kitchen doors. She recognized the security officers who had escorted her outside with kindness rather than force. Then she looked back at Richard. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked gently. Richard lowered his eyes. "Everything I said." Maya slowly shook her head. "No. It was watching everyone else believe they had to stay silent because they were afraid of losing something." Several executives quietly looked toward the floor. Olivia Carter folded her hands. Together, unable to disagree, Maya continued with the same calm voice. "A company is never measured by the size of its buildings or the value of its stock. It is measured by the way the people with the least power are treated when nobody thinks they matter." Her words settled over the ballroom without accusation, yet every sentence reached its mark. Richard nodded slowly. "You are right." He looked around at the employees lining the edges of the room. "I spent years asking people to respect my title. I forgot that respect cannot be demanded. It has to be earned." Maya offered a small, understanding smile. "Titles can open doors. Character decides whether people are glad you walk through them." A quiet breath escaped from several people at once, as though the room itself had been waiting to hear those words. Richard straightened his posture. "If you choose to remove me today, I will understand." Maya remained silent for a few seconds before answering. "If I wanted revenge, I would have revealed the truth the moment you embarrassed me." Richard looked at her with surprise. She continued, "Instead, I wanted everyone here to see that power without humility eventually reveals itself." She glanced toward the board members before returning her attention to Richard. "You will remain as chief executive officer for the next 6 months. Not because you earned forgiveness tonight, but because every employee deserves stability while this company moves forward. During those 6 months, I expect you to learn every name of every person who serves this organization, from the boardroom to the loading dock. When you can treat each one with the same respect, then you will finally deserve the office you have been sitting in." No one applauded. They simply stood in complete silence, understanding they had witnessed something far greater than victory. They had witnessed mercy. 6 months later, the headquarters of Whitmore Hospitality felt different in ways that could not be measured on a financial report. The marble floors still gleamed beneath the morning sun. The glass walls still reflected the skyline stretching across the city. The boardroom still overlooked the same streets, where thousands of employees began another workday. Yet something had quietly changed inside the building itself. People greeted one another by name. Executives paused to thank housekeeping staff. Managers ate lunch beside receptionists instead of disappearing into private dining rooms. The atmosphere no longer carried the invisible weight of fear. It carried something lighter, something stronger. Richard Whitmore arrived earlier than anyone else that morning. He walked through the lobby carrying his own briefcase instead of handing it to an assistant. Before entering the executive elevator, he stopped beside the security desk. "Good morning, Marcus," he said with a genuine smile. "How is your daughter enjoying college?" The security officer smiled back, surprised that the chief executive officer remembered the conversation they had shared weeks before. Richard continued through the building, greeting engineers, accountants, maintenance workers, and cafeteria employees with the same quiet respect. None of those moments attracted photographers. No press release announced them. They mattered anyway. On the top floor, the quarterly board meeting had already begun. Financial reports showed record customer satisfaction, lower employee turnover, and stronger long-term growth than analysts had predicted. Olivia Carter closed the final presentation with a smile. "The numbers improved because the culture improved," she said. No one disagreed. Daniel Hayes quietly placed the finished reports into his portfolio before looking toward the woman seated at the head of the table. Maya Brooks listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. She had made only a handful of visible changes since assuming ownership. She believed lasting leadership was built through consistency, not spectacle. The most noticeable difference in the company was not found in new policies or renovated offices. It was found in the way people treated one another when no one important seemed to be watching. After the meeting concluded, Maya chose not to use the private executive elevator. Instead, she walked through the main lobby wearing a simple navy business suit that reflected the same quiet elegance she had always carried. Several employees waved as she passed. She greeted each one with the warmth of someone who genuinely remembered their names. Near the front entrance, Richard stood speaking with two newly hired banquet servers preparing for another corporate event. He patiently showed them how to welcome guests with confidence while reminding them that every person entering the building deserved kindness before status. As Maya approached, the young servers stepped aside. Richard turned toward her and offered a respectful nod. There was no embarrassment left in his expression, only quiet gratitude. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," he said. Maya returned the nod with an easy smile. "Good morning, Richard." Nothing more needed to be said. Through the towering glass walls, sunlight poured into the lobby, spreading across the polished marble where, months earlier, pride had nearly blinded an entire room. The golden light reached every corner equally, touching expensive suits, service uniforms, polished shoes, and worn work boots without choosing between them. Employees continued walking through the lobby, holding doors open for one another, exchanging smiles, carrying coffee, answering phones, beginning another ordinary day together. Maya paused briefly before stepping outside. She looked back once, watching people from every position moving through the building with quiet purpose. Then she walked into the morning light, leaving behind a company that had finally learned its greatest strength was never found in power alone, but in the simple decision to recognize the dignity of every human being.